Good evening. This is Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome back to my weekly internet show. You can find FFF on the internet at fff.org. First of all, we've got our great big college civil liberties tour, part 2, coming up the week of the 15th through the 19th. We're taking this one out to the West Coast. We start over here on the East Coast, and we're headed to the University of Washington at Seattle, University of California, Davis, University of California, San Diego, University of Arizona, Tucson, University of Colorado, Boulder. So it goes Monday night, Tuesday night, Wednesday night, Thursday night, and Friday night. And we got a great program. We've already done the program over on the East Coast, but it's all spontaneous. It's extemporaneous. You got Glenn Greenwald, Bruce Fine, and myself. Jack Hunter is going to be the moderator. We're doing it in conjunction with the Young Americans for Liberty, who are organizing the event at each of the venues. If you're in these areas, or even if you're not, come on over and join us. It's going to be a great time. It'd be great to have you all interact with the kids. You know, have libertarians there talking to the kids. There's a social hour afterward. Good time to share libertarian perspectives. And so we'd love to have you there. This is, I think, one of the most important programs we've ever put on, simply because of the times in which we live, where the government is exercising and has been exercising for 10 years now. I mean, imagine, see how these emergencies just go on and on and on? They've been exercising powers that are really inherent to dictatorial regimes. The power of the military to take Americans into custody, including Americans who have been acquitted in a federal court trial of terrorism. The military says we don't need to honor that anymore because we're at war. We don't have to honor federal court jury decisions. So they can just stand outside the courtroom or inside the courtroom. As soon as the jury comes in with not guilty, the federal judge, backs off. He's not going to interfere with the military. Soldiers take the American into custody, cart him away to a concentration camp, a military dungeon, what have you, torture him, punish him, do bad things to him, execute him, even though the jury's acquitted him. I mean, these are dictatorial powers, power to assassinate people, including Americans. This is incredible that we're living in this. But, it goes to show you that what happens in so-called periods of great fear and emergency and so forth, the government's going to use those periods for opportunities for power, and not just the terrorism emergency. I mean, we saw that happen in Nazi Germany, where they used the terrorism emergency, the firebombing of the Reichstag, to assume dictatorial powers. The same kind of powers, the power of the military, the Gestapo, to arrest German citizens, cart them away to a dungeon somewhere, a concentration camp, execute them, torture them, what have you, medical experimentation. And ironically, more than 10 years later, same thing. The emergency powers were still going on. You see, the emergency never goes away. And yet the emergency powers, they just keep going and going and going. In Egypt, where these powers exist, and which were one of the main causes of the Egyptian revolt that ousted Mubarak from power, they've been in existence some 30 years. And the military there, just like here, will not relinquish those powers. So these are powers that are inherent to dictatorship, and we still have them here. They effectively suspend the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendments to the Constitution, at least in terrorism cases. And you've got, the Pentagon with this competitive judicial system, and you put judicial in quotation marks because it's really just a sham. It's a kangaroo proceeding. I mean, and where they don't even honor the Constitution. They do everything they can not to honor the Constitution. I mean, the right to speedy trial, it's a joke. I mean, it's a total joke. There's been guys there in Guantanamo that have been in jail for, 10, 11 years without a trial. I mean, that is a violation of speedy trial. And this was exactly what our American ancestors were trying to avoid, where the government keeps people in jail for the rest of their lives, claiming that there's going to be a trial. Yeah, right around the corner, the trial's coming, we promise. And then year after year after year after year, they just delay, 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 delay. So this is important, that these are emergency powers that arose from a terrorist attack. by the way, that was motivated by the anger and rage that the U.S. government itself was doing in the Middle East. Um, but it can arise in an economic setting too. I mean, we see that in Chile. Recall that that was an emergency that the CIA helped to instigate. Richard Nixon had said, I want that economy to scream. I want you to do everything you can to plummet it. The same way they're doing like to the Iranian economy right now. And the idea was that there would be a coup, a military coup. And of course, the military had close ties with Pinochet's military, that is the U.S. military did, close alliances, training together. And so they worked together to have this military coup, which the U.S. military and the CIA loved. I mean, absolutely loved. I mean, the fact that this man and his forces were rounding up people without trials, same kind of thing, emergency powers, but this was an economic emergency, you see. It wasn't a terrorist attack. And they were rounding up people claiming that they were terrorists and communists, mostly communists, because they had served in a socialist government of Salvador Allende. And also two American journalists who were leftists, liberals. They accused them of being communists. They killed them, and the CIA participated in those murders. And no, nothing ever happened to them. We don't even know which CIA agents participated in the murders. We just know that they did because the State Department acknowledged that they did. But of course, nothing's not ever going to happen to them. The federal courts in this land were as submissive as the federal courts in Pinochet's Chile. But that was an economic emergency, you see, and that's what I want to talk to you about tonight. Is that you can have an economic emergency too, and what I really want to talk to you about though is the economic side of what's going on in this country. The welfare state, the managed economy, the regulated economy. I mean, you have certain great big root causes of America's woes. Okay, you've got the military and interventionism and the military empire, 1,000 military bases in over 130 countries. Imagine that. I mean, that's what Chalmers Johnson, who had served as a consultant to the CIA and later became a great critic of interventionism and the military empire. That's what he called it, an empire of bases. And that's one of the root causes of American woes, because that has given rise to the rage and the anger continuously. I mean, with the drone assassinations, the occupations of Afghanistan, Iraq, all the killings there, now the sanctions against Iran. And they're gleeful about all the suffering they're causing the Iranian people. I mean, you can read the accounts in the paper about, oh, the sanctions are working because the Iranian monetary unit fell 40% in 1 week. And people are losing their life savings. I mean, this is exactly what they were doing to the Iraqi people. Exactly. And they were gleeful about that too. They were saying, yeah, see, the sanctions are working because people are getting mad, and they're getting mad at their government. Well, some of them might, but they're not dumb. But one thing about it, the Iranian people are not dumb. They know who's the cause of this. And that anger and that rage is bubbling. Watch what happens if there's a terrorist attack by some Iranian or group of Iranians. What are they going to say? What are U.S. officials going to say? We all know what they're going to say. They're going to say the same thing they said after the 11 years of sanctions by the U.S. government against Iraq, where they killed hundreds of thousands of children, and Madeleine Albright said 500,000 children's deaths are worth it. That after 9/11, they said, oh, the terrorists just hate us for our freedom and values. Doesn't have anything to do with the sanctions, the deaths of the children. They're indifferent to human life. They're not like Americans. They don't place the same value on human life. And the Iranians just hate us for our freedom and values. And it's the same thing they said in 1979 when the Iranians took the U.S. diplomats hostage. Oh, they just hate us for our freedom and values. We're innocent. We're babes in the wood. Well, it was the CIA who had ousted their democratically elected prime minister some 25 years ago, before. They had helped train their secret police force, their domestic CIA, their FBI, train them in torture, and the Shah installed the Shah of Iran, one of the most brutal dictators in history. He oppressed people. I mean, he took them into torture chambers. Anybody dared criticize, man, round them up. And finally, the Iranian people were suffering so bad from this tyranny that they overthrew the Shah, and they ended up, unfortunately, installing this radical Islamic regime. But the U.S. government and many Americans didn't have any idea why they were so angry at the U.S. They bought into this notion that U.S. officials said they hate us for our freedom and values. Well, that's good. That's what they're going to say the same thing here, okay, if the Iranians do something toward the United States. So the root, that's one of the root causes of America's woes. But then you've got the welfare state, this giant transfer, confiscate and transfer society. You've got the regulated society, where the government regulates the most minute aspects of people's economic affairs. You've got the drug war. So you've got these multiple roots that are the root cause, inflation, the monetary debasement, taxation. I mean, that confiscates massive amounts of money from the private sector, productive capital. And that's why people can't save, because the government is plundering and looting them with income taxation, inflation taxation, where they're just printing money and debasing everybody's life savings. So you've got these root causes of America's woes. And of course, you have this silly debate that goes on between Romney and Obama and all the Republicans and Democrats. Who's going to be better at managing this? Oh, that's another one, managing the economy. Okay, that they're arguing over who's the better manager of the economy. Who's going to be the better job creator in chief? It's ludicrous, because you see, it's all one great big statist problem with a lot of statist roots. And it doesn't matter who's in office. If you've got an immoral, defective, destructive system, it doesn't matter who's in power, whether it's Romney or Bush or Obama or Clinton. It's the system. It's the system that's the problem. So, it doesn't matter whether Romney's elected or Obama, because there's just two statists battling over who's going to operate the statist system, and neither one of them can do it because statism is inherently defective. And that's what we libertarians bring to the table, that the paradigm under which we're operating of statism is finished. It cannot work. It doesn't matter who you put in office. We have this musical chairs where the party outside says, oh, I can better manage the economy. Oh, he's mismanaged the economy. But we know 4 years from now, the exact same thing happens, because nobody should be managing the economy. That's a socialist concept. But let me share with you a very interesting, insightful piece in the New York Times. I think it was Saturday, where they were talking about Venezuela. Now, that conservatives love to come down on Hugo Chavez, right? I mean, oh, he's a communist, he's a socialist. Yeah, he is. Okay, he's friends with Fidel Castro. I even got amused by some piece in the Wall Street Journal last week that said we shouldn't ignore the fact that Hugo Chavez is making close contacts and close relationships with China, Iran, and Cuba. Ah, God, we're all supposed to start shaking at this point, because, another communist beachhead in America. Remember all the Cold War nonsense about how the communists were going to take over each Latin American country, and then they were going to come up and cross the Rio Grande with all their troops, and they were going to sweep across Texas and move up the East Coast, and Fidel Castro was going to invade from Florida, and they were going to join up and surround Washington and get a surrender and run the public schools and the interstate highway system and put communist toll booths on all the roads. And it was nonsense. It was absolute nonsense. But this is what the national security state does. They engender these fears, these irrational paranoias. Conservatives buy into this much more than the liberals do, although the liberals do too, to a certain extent. There's always something to be afraid of, because that justifies then the national security state. Well, what was interesting about this Chavez piece is that it's talking about his election. And the thrust of the piece is that people are scared to death in Venezuela and very likely to vote for Chavez. And why are they scared? Well, a lot of them are in the government sector. Well, if you're in the government sector and you think, oh, they're going to know how I voted, you get fired. You see, so the public sector is scared of getting fired. Okay, so they're going to vote for Chavez because they're convinced he's watching how they're voting. All right. And then there's also the sector that's on the dole, that receives government money. And they are scared to death that if they come out against Chavez publicly or vote against him because they think that he's monitoring how they're voting, that they'll cut off their dole. Oh, and by the way, see if this doesn't sound familiar. Chavez has increased social welfare spending during the time of this campaign, during the last year. Now, keep in mind that in Venezuela, they have these dole systems where they pay people who are seniors. They pay them retirement funds. They take care of their health care. They're closely aligned with Fidel Castro. Okay, now keep in mind that this is what conservatives are concerned about, the close alliance between Fidel Castro and Hugo Chavez. Well, in Castro's Cuba, communist, socialist, guess what they have there? They have old age pensions, seniors, and they have government provided health care. They have public schooling. Yes, the government has free schools for all the children in the country. And they have that in Venezuela too. Well, those people are scared of losing their jobs too. You see, so you have this monstrosity of a public sector of people working for the government, as well as people who are receiving a dole from the government that are absolutely scared to death. Now, is that not a little pathetic? I mean, it really goes to show you the power of the welfare state, doesn't it? That the government confiscates this massive amount of wealth from the private sector and uses this money to build up the public sector. You see, everybody in the public sector is living off of the money that's been confiscated from the private sector. So you've got the producers here and you've got the receivers over here. Okay? But the receivers are living off of the confiscated wealth that the private sector produces. And all these people here have a vested interest in keeping the system going. The people in the government sector, they want the government to keep confiscating all this wealth. Now, keep in mind, one of the great messages that Adam Smith made and delivered in his 1776 magnum opus, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, that one of the reasons that nations are wealthier than other nations is because of the accumulation of capital. That means the private sector. That as the private sector gets wealthier and wealthier through savings, keeping some of what you earn, they put it into productive capital, better machines, better equipment. On the farms, for example, the farmers are buying tractors, and so the workers are using tractors instead of hoes. More productivity, higher wages because there's more money coming in, more businesses competing for workers and so forth. So when you've got a very wealthy private sector and it's booming, it's ongoing, that benefits people working in that private sector. Well, what happens is the statists see all this wealth in the private sector and say, hey, wow, we can help the poor. We can confiscate, let's say, 50% of all that wealth, build up this huge government sector, and just dole it out, either in terms of jobs or just write out the checks, give people the money directly. But what you're doing is you're hurting the private sector to the tune of 50%, because that 50% of the wealth that could have been used for private sector, development in terms of capital, better machines, better equipment. That's the only way the standards of living can rise, is in the private sector. It can never be done through the government sector because the government sector is simply living off the tax revenues, the confiscated wealth that is taken from the private sector. So now, this is not the only example. When I was growing up in Laredo, Texas, okay, down on the border, Laredo was considered a real political powerhouse. It's even mentioned in William Manchester's book, The Making of a President, in 1960. Because when I was a kid, the Laredo Democratic Party could guarantee a block vote, guarantee it. And I forget how much, but I think it was like 8,000 or 9,000 people. Okay, and Laredo was a population of about 60,000, 70,000 when I was living there. So they could guarantee this block vote to any national candidate. Imagine that, telling Lyndon Johnson, John Kennedy, we can get you 8,000 votes or whatever the number was. Okay, how could they do that? How could they guarantee it? Well, the reason is because they had a huge public sector, especially in the public schools. See, public schools are government schools. And the advantage of the government schools was that the state, the city, the political machine there, uh, you know, had all these people working for it. I mean, they didn't look at it, oh, sure, they'd say, oh, we're educating the children, we're educating the children. But really, they understood that this was a political powerhouse. Why? Because when I was growing up, everyone was convinced that the city machine was monitoring how people voted. And if you didn't vote the right way, you're out of there. You lose your job as a school teacher, administrator, principal, or whatever. So that's how they could guarantee this block vote, because they could just mobilize and get out the vote of all the school employees, the janitors, the secretaries, the principals, everybody. And that was how they could guarantee this thing. Well, in a sense, that's sort of the same problem we've got here in the United States, isn't it? I mean, you've got this massive part of society that's on the public dole. I mean, let's take the military. The military's on a dole. Okay, there's no question about it. I mean, and I'm talking about the whole military empire, all the overseas bases, all the soldiers, the generals, the privates, the CIA, that other part of the national security state. They're all on the dole. Okay, and, the contractors, the subcontractors, the people that are doing these studies and providing, advice and consultation to the military around Washington. Did you know that, by the way, as an aside, that we now have the wealthiest counties in America right here around Washington? I mean, it's amazing. And they're building like crazy. You ought to see where I'm living. They're building condos like crazy and houses, because all this tax money is coming in here. I mean, we really ought to say thank you, taxpayers of America, for everything you're doing for us. But all these contractors and subcontractors, the weapons providers, the people building the planes, the tanks, they're all on the dole. Okay, now why do I say they're on the dole? Well, because the government confiscates wealth in the private sector and then doles it out to the military. Now, the military, of course, would say, well, yeah, but our dole is essential because national security, and that's what they've brought up ever since World War II. That national security depends on their existence. Well, it's just nonsense, because they are really threatening our national security with what they're doing overseas. All right, I mean, that's the reality. The reason there's this constant rage and anger against the United States because of what the military and the CIA are doing to people overseas. The assassinations, the drones. I mean, look at the reaction of the Pakistani people to these drone attacks. I mean, it's now being reported that people in Pakistan won't even go out in the streets in groups because they're so afraid of getting assassinated by drones. And no trial, no due process, no anything, just fire. And we're not even at war against this country. And it's really an outgrowth of the occupation of Afghanistan, where they're trying to prop up this crooked, corrupt dictatorial regime, the Karzai regime. I mean, that guy hasn't been elected. Come on, give me a break. An election that's fraudulent, where they're stuffing the ballot box, that's not an election. That's just a concocted justification for what the U.S. empire wants to do. But you've got, the unconditional support to the Israeli government. You've got the foreign aid to dictatorships like the dictatorship in Egypt and Jordan, and alliances with Bahrain, the dictatorship there, Saudi Arabia, the dictatorship there. I mean, it goes on. And that's what's threatening to national security and mostly to our freedom. But that's what they say. They say you can't reduce our dole, much less eliminate it. I mean, as a libertarian, I'd say eliminate their dole, close all the bases, okay, and discharge those soldiers, including the generals, into the private sector. Because now all of a sudden you have a doubly positive effect, because now the private sector doesn't have to pay the taxes to fund this enormous sector. But now you've got these soldiers and generals, they're not living off confiscated funds anymore. They're now in the private sector producing wealth. I mean, if you look at, for example, at Cuba, why are they so poor there? Well, because the government has this huge dole system where 90 something percent of people work for the government, and so you've got this small little tiny private sector that has to fund this gigantic public sector. And of course, when you say, well, when they say, what's the solution? We libertarians say, like, ditch the 98% and leave 2% in the government. I mean, the state is, even here in the United States, go ape. Oh no, that would cause unemployment. I mean, they don't get it. They don't get that a private sector is the source of the wealth that's confiscated, that's then funding the public sector. But look, you've got Social Security. Now, I know what Social Security recipients say. Oh, well, we put it in. We have a right to get it back. It's a contract. They promised us. Reality is that Social Security is taking money from the young and the productive and transferring it to seniors. That's the reality. Now, we can sit here and say, well, but wait a minute. The seniors, they took my money and they're now dead. And they took it over my entire life, and I want it back. But you can't have it back because they're dead. You see, you can't sue them because the Supreme Court has long held that Social Security is just a welfare program. It's not a retirement account. It's not a contract. It's not a promise. And so the reality is that it's a straight transfer program, no different from the military, confiscating wealth out of the private sector and paying it over here. And the same with Medicare, and education grants and federal aid to education. I mean, the public school administrators, Now, if you ask all these people, do you feel we have a problem in America with out of control spending and the national debt and the debt ceiling that keeps getting raised, and piles and piles of debt on tops of the American people, and inflation to pay off this debt, and the fact that the communist regime in China is a big bondholder of the U.S. government? Do you see a problem in all this? Every one of them would say, absolutely, we got a big problem. I mean, this is very, very grave problem. It's a serious problem. We can see what's happening with Greece and Italy and Spain and all these other countries that have spent themselves into bankruptcy. But then each one of these sectors says, so you need to cut out of the military. You see, the Social Security, Medicare, education grants, foreign dictators, they're another group. They'll all say, no, cut his dole, but don't cut my dole because I have a right to it. Or national security is at stake, or the children, we can't leave the children behind. And so everybody that's in this public sector is scared to death of losing their dole. It's no different in principle than what's going on in Venezuela, and to a certain extent Cuba, where people have been working for the state for since the Cuban Revolution, 59 or so. That's one of the real horrors of the welfare state, is that it creates this mindset of dependency, of entitlement, of right, that I have a right to the fruits of other people's earnings. Well, I've got an idea on this. Why don't we cut it all out at the same time? It's been a disastrous experiment. It came into existence, started in Franklin Roosevelt's era, where they used a temporary emergency to enact a permanent change in American life. I mean, the Great Depression was over, 50 years ago? Why do we still have Social Security and other aspects of the New Deal? I mean, you see how they use these emergencies to transform life on a permanent basis, and they're saying these war on terrorism powers are permanent too. And so why don't we just dismantle the whole thing? Everybody's got to give up his dole. All these people in the public sector are now going to be totally privatized. Okay, and I know that there's a sense of fear. It's the same sense of fear that exists in Venezuela. Oh my gosh, I couldn't do it. How would I do it? And human beings are resilient. We got to believe in ourselves. We got to believe in others. We got to believe in the freedom, in the free market. We got to believe in freedom again. I mean, Americans once rejected this junk. For more than 100 years, they rejected economic statism. If you eliminate the horrible example of slavery, the exception to the rule, other exceptions, tariffs, and so forth. But I mean, by and large, Americans rejected Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, standing army, Pentagon, CIA, FBI, all this fear, fear, fear mongering, the debasement of the currency. They had gold and silver coins as their money. No income taxation, no immigration controls. It was the most remarkable period really in the history of the world. And that's what we've got to start thinking in terms of. Is not how do we make this status system work, because it can't work. It'll never work. It's done. It's finished. The question is, how do we restore a free society to our land? How do we get people to believe in themselves, to believe in freedom, to believe in the free market, to believe in voluntary charity, believe in self-reliance and can-do? That's our quest as libertarians. And not only to talk in terms of the morality of the free market and the efficiency of the free market, but encouraging people that freedom really does work, that it really does raise people's standard of living, and people do respond in a positive way when they're faced with whatever challenges they happen to be facing in life. And sure, there's a few people that are in the cancer wards that can't make it, but isn't that what voluntary charity is all about? That's the show. I won't be with you next week or the following. Well, maybe the following week, not sure. But next week, for sure, no show. I'll be on the road, the College Civil Liberties Tour, and give you guys a great report on it afterward. And thanks so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in 2 or 3 weeks. Good night.